Good evening. Tonight we're going to continue with our fraction unit, lesson 12. I can reason using benchmarks to compare two fractions on a number line. Now guys, when we talk about this number line and these benchmarks is basically what we're always going to think about when we're trying to find which fraction is greater or which one's less than. And these benchmarks are going to be 0, a half, and a whole. So when we're placing certain fractions like 1/5, 3/6, 5/8, and 9/10, when we want to place those fractions on a number line, we're going to be using benchmarks like 0, and a half, and 1. So let's look at 1/5. Where would 1/5 be placed on this number line? 1/5 is kind of small. We know that is less than a half, so it's going to be very close to being right about over here at 1/5. Now, if we look at 3/6, we can actually divide and find an equivalent fraction and use the greatest common factor, which was 3. And this, look at this becomes a half. So an equivalent fraction to 3/2 would be 3/6. We could place 3/6 here. Now 5/8 is actually very close to being 4/8, right? So if we wanted to make 4/8 and find the equivalent fraction to 4/8, we could use the greatest common factor, which would be 4. And look at that. We found another equivalent fraction would be 4/8. So 5/8 is just a little bit higher than 4/8. So this would now become 5/8 right here. And 9/10 is 1/10 being away from a whole. So that would be very close to being a whole. So we're going to put 9/10 here. So we use these benchmarks of 0, 1.5, and 1 to help place different fractions. And remember, look for those fractions that we can try to find equivalent fractions by using the greatest common factor to either divide or even multiply to help us place them using these benchmarks. In this problem, they want us to take 2/3 and a half and 4/10 and 1/6 and place them on the number line. And once we place them on the number line, then we can actually figure out who's greater, less than, or equal to. So if we look at 2/3, let's make a fraction, a tape diagram, and demonstrate 2/3. All right, so 2/3 would actually be kind of cut in half, wouldn't it be? All right, because if we're saying a halfway point of 2/3, we would say that this one right here, it's being cut apart, right? Because it's 2/3. So this section right here is being cut apart. So it really would look like 1.5 over 3. So this is actually kind of being a little bit over, being very close to that, the 2/3, being very close to that. So where would that be placed? So that would be a little past the halfway mark. So we're going to put 2/3 little past that halfway mark because it's a little bit greater than a half. Then we want to place a half. And a half is actually right here. It's in the center of our number line. And then what about 4/10? Well, if we look at 4/10, remember I always told you to always find an equivalent fraction by try to use the greatest common factor, which we couldn't because 4 can't go into 10. So the closest one we could use would be 2. And that would become 2/5. Well, where would 2/5 be? That is not quite being 2/4. Would not be close to the halfway. So if it's not close to the halfway point, we would actually have to put 4/10 before that halfway point. Then we've got something like 1/6. And 1/6 is definitely very small, and it's not even close to being the halfway. So we're going to put 1/6 closer to 0. So now we actually placed all of our fractions where they need to be, and now we can actually say which ones are greater, less than, or equal to. So let's look at the first one right here. 2/3 is greater than, less than, or equal to a half. Well, if we look up at our number line, here's our benchmark of a half. Here's our halfway point. 2/3 is a little bit greater than a half. So we would actually place a greater sign facing 2/3. The next one is 4/10. And 4/10 we see is a little less than being a half. And then we see if it's greater than, less than, or equal to 1/6. 1/6 is much closer to 0 than it is to the halfway mark. 4/10 is closer to the right-hand side than it is to the left-hand side. So we're going to say that 4/10 is greater than 1/6. See how helpful the number line is in finding out which numbers are greater than, less than, or equal to. When I say numbers, I mean fractions. Sorry. All right, we want to place 5/12, 3/4, and 2/6 on this number line. And we're going to be using, again, the number line with these benchmarks in it, 0, a half, and 1. And we're going to look at these three fractions and see where they would be placed according to these benchmark fractions. Well, let's look at 5/12. I know if I was to look at 6/12 and I was to find an equivalent fraction and use the greatest common factor, which would be 6, I would find that that would be equal to a half. So it's not 6/12, it's 5/12. So 5/12 is going to be a little bit less than a half, since 6/12 is a half. So now we place 5/12. 3/4, well, that is 1/4 being away from being a whole. So I can place that closer to 1 because it's 1/4 away from being a whole. 3/4 is almost a whole. And then we're left with 2/6. And if we look at 2/6, we could say that the greatest common factor to help find the equivalent fraction would be, let's divide by 2, and we would get 1/3. And so 2/6, which is an equivalent fraction 1/3, is much smaller, and it's not close to being a half, so it's probably like in the midpoint here between 0 and a half, and this would be 2/6. But now part of the problem that we have to do is actually make compare them by writing it out by using the greater, less than, or equal to sign. So let's look at 5/12 and 3/4. 3/4 is greater than, or less than, or equal to 5/12. Well, if we look at our number line, here is 5/12 and here is 3/4. 3/4 is much closer at 1 than 5/12. There's more going to the right, whereas 5/12 is more closer to the left. So 3/4 is definitely bigger than 5/12. So we can also say it this way: 5/12 is greater than, less than, or equal to 3/4, and it would just go the opposite way because 5/12 is less than 3/4. All right, 1/2 is greater than, or least than, or equal to 1/4. Now, if we remember that number line that we always want to kind of draw out to help us, and we place those benchmarks, we kind of can figure out where those fractions that we're placing on there, where they would lie. So definitely by looking at this, we know 1/4 is much smaller than a half. So we would say a half is greater than 1/4. And then continue on to 6/8 is greater than, less than, or equal to 1/2. Now if we look at 6/8, 6/8, we could use the greatest common factor to help simplify this or find an equivalent fraction would be 2, and this would become 3/4. 3/4 is definitely bigger than a half because it's closer to being a whole. It's 1/4 away. So 6/8 is greater than 1/2. Again, using to find the equivalent fractions definitely helps us figure out where they would place on the number line. Now 4/6 is greater than, less than, or equal to 9/12. Now if you look at 4/6, 4/6 could say is kind of closer to what we would think 4/8. And 4/8 is equal to a half. So 4/6 is not really closer to a half, where we would look at 9/12, and it's 3 more twelfths away from being a whole. So that one's closer to being a whole, whereas 4/6 is not even close to being a half. So we would say that 9/12 is greater than 4/6. All right, guys, you give your best on the next couple of problems. Don't give up. 3/4 is greater than, less than, or equal to 3/5. 2/3 is greater than, less than, or equal to 1/4. 4/5 greater than, less than, or equal to 8/12. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. Have a wonderful night, guys.